religious Zionism, even Christian Zionism, which I'm completely against. But the fundamental idea of Zionism, which comes from the word...
Sure. So I was also wondering why, because this is a debate about pro-Palestine versus pro-Israel, I was also wondering why you believe that indigeneity,
which is that your identity is the pre-colonial identity that was born and rooted to a particular and specific line that is essential to that people's identity and way of life. They've maintained a constant presence in that land, and they collectively identify with this land. And the reason why it's so important to speak about this is because there are a lot of people who claim to be pro-Palestinian who use Palestinian struggles in order to try to delegitimize my ancestral connection and my rights to live there. So I'm for the right for other people to live there as well. When people are trying to delegitimize who I am in the collective that belongs here as well, that's when I have a problem.
Okay, so here's sort of where I'm coming from. From what I understand about indigeneity, it is a concept, just like intelligence, love, which means that it can be essentially defined by what it is, but not necessarily, it's more difficult to define what it isn't. My understanding of indigeneity, that it has relation against colonialism. Also, similarly, my understanding of Zionism is that, especially through settler action, we know that it is...
Previous colonizers that were here were the British, firstly being the Romans that colonized the land, renamed it to Palestine, and kicked out the majority of the Jewish people.
Sure.
Then we have the Byzantine Empire, we have the Caliphates, we have the Ottomans, and eventually we have the British.
Does that have any say on the Jewish Palestinians who exist, who are not afforded full citizenship? What happens to them? Because Palestinians are a monolith, and we understand...
are not receiving full citizenship. And
well, if you're Palestinian, then you don't have full citizenship in the state of Israel.
Right, so we're talking about now the consequences that happened after the British were here.
Sure.
And the way that British colonized...
Do you think that, do you think that their citizenship is a direct action of the British?
No, I think that the division of the land is a direct consequence of what the British did to our population.
Okay.
Let me explain where that comes from.
Okay, we have to pause there. You've been voted out by the majority. We've returned to your
getting good.
Hello.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good, thank you.
So I want to start with something I wrote that you said. You said, return of the people to the land and indigeneity is pre-colonial identity. You're identifying the Jews being indigenous, and that's why they were not in colonialism. It was too clear. Do you agree with how I described it?
Well, so the idea that the Jews should have the rights to return to their ancestral homeland is a decolonization movement, not a colonization movement. Now, we can criticize certain policies the government has, the IDF has, and I might even agree with certain things. There's a lot of criticism that I have of the current structure. But by its nature, it is an anti-colonial decolonization movement.
So there are words in Hebrew that were used pre the creation of the state of Israel to settle, to colonize. If they believed themselves to not be colonizers, why were they directly using this language back then?
Back then, what that term meant was development of land. So if you read Herzl's writing, he talks about that the native inhabitants are the Jewish people. There are other inhabitants, what we call today as Palestinians who live there, and we should live together with them. And the use of the term colonization then, obviously today it's not a popular word, we're all against this idea, then meant development of the land. So you have to also understand the context in which words are being used. Because words are sounds coming out of the mouth, and the meanings
right now, because the world, the West has now recognized that colonialism is bad, we are saying, oh, we don't recognize that language. That language meant something to them, and it was used for a particular reason.
And it means
you dissociating yourself, or Israel dissociating itself from that language, does not erase the preconditions that it existed, the plan that it was trying to achieve.
The plan that it was trying to achieve is to bring back sovereignty to the indigenous population. When you dig in this land and find Jewish history, this is where we come from. Now, there are individuals that use the term colonization because then it was very popular. And it didn't mean go and exploit another population, take away their resources, exploit it back to another. That's not what it meant, and that's what it means today. And so back then, it meant the development of land. We both agree.
It's exactly colonial language, and it's being used today.
If you are an indigenous person and you want to develop your land, that's not colonization. It is colonization or not colonization.
If people existed in that land prior to you going to develop that land,
you had a constant presence, and I didn't make an argument against
Palestinians.
I'm making an argument that the Jews are indigenous to land of Israel, and I'm all for that.
And they existed.
I'm all for that coexistence.
Development meant erasing all of that.
The
Meant
British,
erasing their identity of indigeneity as well. It was just Jewish indigeneity. Just Jewish supremacy.
This is what I was saying in my previous point. Okay, the way that the British colonized every single region is they divided and conquered. We can see the consequence of that between Pakistan and India. We can see that in Afghanistan. We can see that in Nigeria between the Igbos, the Hausa Fulani, and the Yoruba.
And
we can see that absolutely, where they convinced the Israeli population that Palestinians, the Arabs, and Muslims were all their enemies, hold up, and they convinced the Palestinian Arabs that the Jews were just an extension of European colonialism, which you're falling into. And unfortunately, we fought a war in 1948 for which I was not there, and the consequences of that war and the several wars that happened after is the situation that we're in today.
So you're saying that the British had a plan of colonization and that Ben Gurion, Herzl, and every person, or Shamir, the leader of Lehi, who actually reached out to Hitler, to work with Hitler, to start... You're laughing. Maybe you're not familiar with it.
I'm very familiar with the Zionists reaching out to the Nazis in order to get them to let the Jews leave so that they wouldn't kill them.
The leader of Lehi, who became the Prime Minister of Israel, had correspondents reached out to Hitler and asked for my enemy to work with me to take over the land of Palestine, to take over Israel.
The British were the ones controlling the mandate of Palestine at that time.
Exactly.
Not
so
the
Nazis. The Lehis were willing to work with the Nazis.
They were not willing to work. They were trying to get their people out of what was being controlled by the Nazis. If you have a hostage taken by, if you have someone that takes a hostage, you're going to negotiate with them to get them out of there. So the Zionists, let me finish my point.
I just want to ask. You didn't let me finish. You were speaking the entire time.
You asked a question and I did answer. Okay? You talked about the fact that the Zionists had relations and contact with the Nazis. This is true. The Nazis had colonized and occupied. Yes, the Nazis had occupied the European area, and the Jews were under their authority. So the Zionists wanted to get the Jews out of there so that they wouldn't be killed. No. I'm talking about the Nazis in Europe. They had taken control over Europe, and the Jews realized that they would be killed, so the Zionists tried to negotiate to get the Jews out. This has nothing to do. You're mixing a whole bunch of things to come to
Sorry, we have to pause. You've been voted out by the majority. Please return to your seat. Zionism, a decolonial movement. When the Zionists needed the sponsor of a colonial empire like the British, and today cannot exist without a settler colonial state and an empire like the United States. Without these two things, that project would not have been possible. There's a reason why Theodore Herzl had to petition to the Ottomans, to other European powers, until the Balfour Declaration was issued. And if you look at that declaration, out of the 28 articles in there, seven of them focused on the rights of Jews and didn't even mention the word Palestinians. It mentioned the non-Jewish population. And with that revisionist history, why do we forget about the Arab Revolt in 1936, which the British squashed while they let the Zionists develop their own proto-state? They had arms, they had a paramilitary, they had a parliament. Palestinians weren't allowed to have that, and if they did, it was squashed. So you can't just say colonization is just words. Logically, that's colonization. There's no one denying that there is a Jewish history in Palestine. No one is saying that Jews can't or shouldn't live there. But there's a difference between coming and living and coexisting versus coming and drawing borders and maintaining it through guns, through iron walls, which Jabotinsky mentioned. That doesn't sound indigenous. And speaking of indigeneity, if you are so indigenous or you claim to be indigenous, why did they bomb the orange trees in Jaffa? Just as you see the olive trees being burned in the West Bank. And with all of that said as well, why are the houses that were destroyed, if you were so decolonial, why were they destroyed and rebuilt with European-style architecture? Why do many Israelis participate in Eurovision? Why do they identify more with Europe? That doesn't sound indigenous to me.
There's a lot of questions.
Yeah.
First of all, salam alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Muhammad. It's nice to meet you. I'm glad to be able to speak.
You're funny.
It's the truth. You know, I'm from that land, okay? We're both actually from this land, and I don't hate you. And the idea of me greeting you respectfully is something that's clearly making you laugh because it's uncomfortable or it's new. And I think that
it doesn't shock me at all.
Let me finish what I'm saying. I think there's a new generation that's being formed that live in the land, that recognize each other's suffering, identity, and want to build something further. Now, let me be able to answer.
You believe the suffering is parallel?
I'll let you go off on 3 minutes of many different claims. I'm going to try to get back to all of them. There's a lot that you said there. So first of all, why is it a anti-colonial decolonization movement? Like we said, the original population, the first peoples of the land are the Hebrews / the Judeans / the Israelites. We were colonized by the Roman Empire. They renamed our land Palestine. It is a foreign term that actually came from the Philistines that were a pre-Greek population from the island of Greece, not actually the ancient population that you come from, because actually most Palestinians descend from Jews that were converted to Christianity and Islam over time, mixed in with other Arabs who poured in, who created the post-colonial identity called Palestinian. Now, I see Palestinians as native to the land. as having a right to the land. Now, what happens with the British colonizing the area? They forced our peoples to see each other as enemies. And why did they write the Balfour Declaration? They wrote that in order to give the impression to the Arab world, including the local Palestinians, to think that the idea of Zionism is an extension of European colonialism. And by the way that you're speaking, they still did their job. And the same way many Israelis or Jews think that all Palestinians, all Muslims, all Arabs are a bunch of terrorists, that would show that the British did their job. Why? Because they appointed Hajimin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, who actually met with Hitler, who was great friends with Hitler. This was not a person that was appointed by the Palestinians. This was a person that was appointed by the British. Why? Because they wanted to convince both of our people that we were extensions of each other's demise. Now, why did Herzl and other individuals reach out to the Ottomans? Because the Ottomans were controlling the land. Of course, if there's a colonizer, you would try to negotiate to try to get your land back. And when the British eventually took that land, well, they tried to speak with the British. The fact that you can go and criticize certain things that were done wrong during war, orange trees being destroyed, homes being uprooted, or certain style. I mean, that's not war. Let me finish my point. You're speaking in English. I wouldn't say that because you're speaking
Time
in
for
English.
just a few questions.
So because a lot of Jews had an experience, in Europe and came back with knowing architecture, I did not blame you. I did not blame you for anything. So why'd you bring it up? Knowing architecture, because this is exactly what the British did in order to make the perception of the Jewish people.
Yeah, no further questions. Thanks.
Al-Husseini supports Hitler and wants to kill Jews. And what I'm saying is that not all Palestinians believe that. And this is what we have to break free. Now, you talked about the architecture, really? I mean, a lot of the Jews had an experience in Europe, so that was the architecture that they had access to. Because that's where they're from. That's where they had an experience in. That's where they're from. Genetically, historically, anthropologically. So why they're not allowing DNA tests in Israel? They do allow DNA tests in Israel. That's a DNA company called MyHeritage, which is an Israeli company. They don't allow certain companies that go and sell your information. That's the difference. These are anti-Semitic points that you read on Reddit or somewhere online. Right. But there are DNA companies that are based in Israel. Look up MyHeritage. Fact check this. There, you were born outside. I wouldn't say that you come from anywhere else other than the land that me and you both belong to. Ethnically, my parents and grandparents were born in Palestine. My grandfather's cousin's house 2 days ago. Do you know what happened to it? 2 days ago, from when we recorded this, it was destroyed by American-funded bulldozers on his house. You talk about, oh, there has to be a future with our Palestinian cousins. What future when you destroy my grandpa's cousin's house where 24 people were living in that house? Where are they supposed to go now? Tell me, where do you want them to go? If you want a future with us, where do you want them to go? That is a colonial tactic to destroy a home and uproot it, and then who knows what's going to happen? It'll be rebuilt by someone else, because that has been the end goal of Zionism, which to have as few Palestinians as possible with as many Jews as possible. That might be the goal of some Zionists. No, that's not the goal of spectrum. Left wing, right wing. You're speaking. It's a fascist spectrum. You're speaking to me at this moment. No, it's a spectrum of decolonization. No, it's a spectrum of decolonization in any population. There are individuals that are bad individuals. Now, I don't know what happened to your family, and I'm sorry that happened. It's on my Instagram. Anybody could watch it. Sure. So you came and destroyed someone's house. Not you. They destroyed someone's house. That's a very important thing, because the whole entire time you're saying you, it's all about you, right? No, it's not exactly. It's not all about me. And like, not all about you're wearing is not a cultural appropriate keffiyeh. Our ancestors wore long before Palestinians actually took it from the Iraqi population. Right. We wore like it wasn't just always there, and you just added the Hebrew and all of that. We wore sutras for thousands of years. The Druze have it. The Bedouin have it. A lot of Middle Easterners have their sudra or keffiyeh, different words under different languages, that represents our culture and our connection to this land. And if you were wearing keffiyeh, I would see you as a cousin. I would see you as an ally. Not being. If you saw me as a cousin, you wouldn't be building walls. You wouldn't be destroying your grandfather's house. Now, people you are defending would be doing that. Talk about destruction of homes. There are two reasons as to why. There's no justification for any destruction. There is no justification for occupation. There is no justification. It happens for none of it as well. Whenever a house, I don't know your situation, so I'm not going to speak on this. Whenever a house is built, more likely. Whenever a house is built illegally on a territory that they did, this is a settler narrative. No, this is a settler narrative. Homes have also been destroyed. You don't have a right to compensate. Who determines who owns what land? Who determines that? There's Palestinian Authority, the Israeli government. Yeah, which are all law in the United Nations. It was created by white European colonizers. Were to go into the home of another Palestinian and build up a house, that house would get removed. If the Jew goes into your house, that's not what's happening. That's not what's happening. The house has been there. My family has been there for generations. Jews and Palestinians who build illegally, their house gets removed.
Even the term legal,
Another addition. If
morality is not what enables legality.
You own the property, do not own the property.
Okay, pause here. You've been voted out by the majority. Please return to your seat.
I like your tortilla.
Thank you.
It's really nice.
Thank you.
Taken from my culture. Okay, so can you talk to me about this idea that you have of you being indigenous? Do you believe in the Torah?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. So in the Torah, it talks about how the Israelites went to the land of Canaan. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
And in the Torah, it talks about how the Israelites shall go to Canaan and slay the people there with the sword and then take over that land. Do you agree with that?
No.
Okay, so in the Torah, it talks about Abraham, who came from the land of Ur, not from the land of Canaan. Canaan in modern-day Palestine. So if I, a Palestinian, take a DNA test, which I have, my DNA comes back almost entirely Canaanite, okay? If an Ashkenazi Jew takes that same DNA test, their DNA comes back entirely European. So talk to me about how you think this is an...
Abraham has eventually a descendant called Canaan, who was born in Africa. Eventually, the Canaanites descend from Africans who are living at that region. The Canaanites eventually take the land of the descendants of Shem, which are the Hebrews. The descendant of Shem is Evel. The descendants of Evel are the Ivrim, the Hebrews. The Canaanites actually take the land of the Hebrews, which causes the Hebrews to be displaced. That is why Abraham is born in displacement. He's actually the first Zionist. He's the first Jew returning to his ancestral homeland and being able to live there, but doesn't yet have control over the land because the Canaanites still control. Fast forward 2 generations later to the 12 tribes, Joseph, they come from Egypt, they spend time in slavery, and eventually they come back again to their ancestral indigenous land of the Hebrews that the Canaanites have taken over. And then there are 3 conditions for the Canaanites. Either you live with the rule of law, you fight us, or you leave. Some left, some decided to live with the rule of law of accepting the 7 laws of Noah, no idolatry, no killing, no stealing, no immoral sex act. And those who didn't went into war. So now you talked about DNA. There's no such thing really as Canaanite DNA. They found individual.
Oh let me.
No. The sources.
This is not factual.
The source. Everything is factual. And Jubilee will source all of those facts for us and for all the people listening. I let you finish your claim.
There's no such thing as DNA.
No, I didn't say there's no such thing as
Canaanite DNA.
Okay, so let me explain.
How a DNA test would say that I am Canaanite.
When you find
descending from Canaan, where
that's exactly what I'm going to answer. When you look into the ground and you find bones, they are assuming that this is not a Hebrew population, that this is a Canaanite population. Why? Because people are using the saying, oh, before it was the land of the Hebrews, it was Canaanite. But before it was Canaanites, it was the land of the Hebrews. So people are assuming that the DNA found in that area has to be Canaanite. Now, it might be that you descend from that population that had come into the land and taken the land of Hebrews and were idolaters and actually horrible people, right? You have Samson and Delilah.
I'm Palestinian, so I'm descending from horrible people.
I'm not saying that you're descendant of horrible people. You're intentionally putting words in order to try to demonize me.
What did you say about the Canaanites?
If you did your DNA, I think your DNA would actually come Jewish. The same way that the Jews who had an experience in Europe comes out Jewish.
I agree with you that my ancestors are Jewish. Correct. So what you are saying, that you have a territorial claim to the land of Israel, is basically like someone from, let's say, America, or a white man from Europe, converts to Islam. He converts, he's a Muslim now. And then he says, okay, so in this land, there have been Muslims for generations. I'm going to go to this land. I am Muslim, and it is my land. Okay? So just because you are of a religion does not mean that you DNA and are from that land. Right? So yes, my ancestors were Jewish. They are my ancestors, and they came from that land. I have similar DNA to them. But if someone in Europe is Jewish, that does not suddenly make them indigenous to the land.
I'm glad that we changed from you being Canaanites to originally being descendants of Jewish people.
Okay,
that's not accurate. But let me explain. To be a Jew is a descendant of an ancient civilization. Even if you don't believe in God and Allah, you're still a Jew.
Okay, so before the Torah, what were those people?
Hebrews. And in order to become a Jew, you have to go through years of the process of adopting an identity, history, a culture. Yes, generations, thousands of years. Now, the Jews in Europe, which is not the majority of the Jewish people even in the land of Israel, The Jews who live in Europe had an external experience. They are not converts from Europe. They are indigenous people who went to Europe.
When does it end though? So,
if you look at other indigenous populations,
right.
Tibetans,
Okay, we're
Yazidis,
out of
Kurds,
time.
Native Americans,
We have
what
to-
population
Hey,
comes from
guys. Pause. We're out of time. Let's move on. Thank you.
My final surrounded claim is that Zionism is not colonization, it is decolonization.
All right, if you would like to be the next debater, get to the chair in 3, 2, 1.
Rudy, I respect your ability to have a calm demeanor, and I think that your patience can do well for an Instagram career. I just don't understand how you can look someone in the face whose family's home has been bulldozed by the IOF and tell him that you see him as a cousin. That is just insane. And I want you to be able to explain that, how you rationalize the incongruity of saying that you were here to protect people that are indigenous and living in the land, while whitewashing and carrying water for a genocide.
So the same way that there are many Palestinians who killed family members of mine, people of mine, I don't see all Palestinians as responsible for that. So if he's going to criticize the policy that was done against his family, I don't know the particular case that happened against his family, but it sounds horrible. I can recognize that that's something horrible and still be able to see him as my family. What you currently associate is that anyone who is pro-Israel and believes that the Jews have a right to self-determine must mean that they're anti-Palestinian. And that is what has been plaguing us from being able to move forward. Because I see Palestinians as my family. I support their rights to live in this land as equal citizens of this land.
I want to believe that. I want to believe that those are your genuine feelings. I really do. I'm going to sit here and criticize your own personal moral ideology. But what I will say is the regime that you are justifying does not believe that. They do not see people that they bomb indiscriminately. I've experienced the tactics of the IDF, not because I've stepped foot in Israel or Gaza or the West Bank, but because ICE agents right now are currently being trained by the IOF, the tactics to use against civilian populations. They might have different uniforms, but the ideology is exactly the same. You permanently call the entire population a security threat, you militarize enforcement, and then you demand that those citizens are detained or removed in order to show the full force of that regime, whether that is Israel or whether that's the United States. So when I'm seeing that done to my neighbors domestically, whether that's migrants or citizens that are being killed in the street, or I see that in a Palestinian that is under rubble from Israeli bombs, I feel that sense that I know what humanity looks like. And when I see people who defend Israel tell me to not believe my own eyes, when I'm watching videos constantly scrolling of babies being murdered, I cannot sit here and say that you believe what you say when you say that Israel is having their best interest.
Sure. So there's plenty of disagreements that I have with the Israeli government. I don't know one Israeli that doesn't disagree with aspects of the Israeli government, and you can go into those details. You said that Israel is indiscriminately bombing Palestinians. That is not true. What we see, that is not. I let you finish the statement.
I don't know how to allow you to just say lies like
as
that.
an Israeli, okay, who served in the army, who was brought back in the reserves, and was in Gaza, in Lebanon, and Syria, doing my best to prevent us from fighting and to stop this situation from continuing. It is not true what you're saying. What you saw is Instagram reels. What you saw is videos on YouTube. And yes, there were horrible situations where civilians died, and that's my family. Those are my cousins that have perished due to this conflict. And that's why I give us a greater responsibility. I let you finish. I give us a greater responsibility to correct what happened. But Israel does not indiscriminately bomb. It sends leaflets, it postpones, it does everything that it can to prevent civilians dying. Right?
How long before they bomb a hospital, or how long before they bomb a school?
72 hours. I found leaflets there of 72 hours.
72 hours to leave your roots to communities before we bomb the shit out of it.
To get
That's what you're saying right now.
Unfortunately, Hamas has used your area in order to fight from there and has stored weapons and are using those weapons to actually attack civilians.
Let me tell you, if there are someone that's robbing a bank and they hold up children as human shields, I'm going to say that the police shooting through those kids is not something that we can justify.
No,
so I don't think it's just what you say about, we're going to be respectful. That's why we have justification to bomb hospitals. That is absolutely
language
insane.
of being respectful. If we look at the two...
I said I respect you for it, but I can't do it after you're saying this right now. But I'm understanding what your motives are when you say that you worked in the IOF.
There are over 2 million... There are over 2 million people...
Not population reality. So let's just hear the propaganda from the population propaganda.
Projection.
Pause. We've been voted out by the majority. Please return to your seat.
I'm going to start off with saying if historical connection and indigenous roots legitimizes trumping sovereignty of nations,
then modern borders are meaningless. And if it doesn't, then Zionism is a political movement. And we have evidence of this, as Theodore Herzl himself is and was an atheist. We also have quotes coming from Ben Gurion, who said, we want to expel the Arabs. We also had other people who have referred to Arabs as rocks that needed to be moved throughout the land of Judea. I actually have the name of it right now, Weitzman. I also want to say that we want to look at the word of Palestine. I know you were mentioning that this came from the Romans. Actually, Herodotus, the father of history, mentioned Palestine many times. It actually comes from a Greek word describing the coast. So this isn't a term that came from the Romans of colonizing, and we actively see Zionism Palestine wasn't even the first option. Why did the Zionistic Congress consider Uganda and Argentina? That is a colonial project.
So let me answer those things. So you said a lot of things. Herodotus that you're bringing up is a Greek person. The pre-Greek population in Crete were the Palestinians. So obviously the collective that is now the Greek Empire would like to call other territories as part of their territory and would call that land Palestine. But the moment that land really became called Palestine is the moment that the Romans conquered, way after the Greek Empire is the Romans, and in order to insult the memory of the Jews, they called that name Palestine. Why? Because that's actually also a Hebrew word which means invaders. Now, I don't consider you to be an invader, but you should know that Palestine, literally in Hebrew, means invaders. Now, you talked about colonization, decolonization, indigenous populations. On the territory that was the indigenous population, being the Hebrews, the Jews, the Israelites, it was colonized by different empires. There was never a country that was built on top of it since. It was always in the hand of foreign empires.
Just a couple of questions for you.
To being the land of Israel. Now, I do support indigenous liberations all across the world.
Shoot.
Tibetans, Yazidis, the Kurds, the Aboriginals.
Okay.
Now, there's different types of indigenous liberations. Some populations want a state. Some populations don't want a state.
So there was a sovereign state of Palestine.
There was not a sovereign state of Palestine. There was a British mandate of Palestine.
Okay, but there were still people who identified themselves as Palestinians.
Sure, I don't have a problem you identifying yourself as Palestinian.
So what I'm trying to say is that there were people who actually, you don't even need,
that's all.
Technically under international law, you don't need to have a sovereign state in order for it to qualify as occupation. An occupation can be imposed on people who are not a part of a sovereign state, but of a collective identity, who have had, as you said earlier, a continuous presence on that land. I think one of the
Jews had a continuous presence.
And so did the Canaanites and the people who converted to. I don't want to get into that debate, but besides that, there are people who have been there continuously. And actually, there is plenty of ways to go about this, but there is evidence that prior to 1948 and prior to the creation of the modern day state of Israel, that there's an incredible influx of people who have converted to Judaism. Yes, there is. It's actually from South Africa. Multiple people.
This is not
after the fall. They will fact check, and it's written in Haaretz. That they after.
So you see an anti-Israel publication that posts an article. You read an article and you believe everything said.
I don't want to get into ad hominem. Let's focus on facts. And to my knowledge, it is true, and it has been documented pretty well that after the fall of a South African apartheid state, that people converted to Judaism and suddenly had a more legitimate claim.
The fall of the apartheid state happened way after the creation of the state of Israel. What are you talking about?
I'm just saying that there's an influx of people that came and converted to the state.
No, there are Jews who are returning home. There are not Jews who are converting.
Okay, so why don't we have the Palestinian right to return, right?
That right of return.
But how come it hasn't happened? And if we had a Palestinian majority, I don't think
that's a great question. Why it hasn't happened? The reason it hasn't happened is because my population and your population are raised to see each other as enemies. And when we have conversations, it's always the idea of Jewish indigeneity and our access to the land and our liberation means the destruction of yours. And I'm against the destruction of your people. Okay. I'm for the idea of your population.
Okay, Zionism's earliest founders, and it has been documented, if they're all about, returning back home, why is every single one of them writing about colonialism? Yes, it is. We could look at...
Herzl and other individuals spoke about creating a civilization with the other inhabitants.
You didn't recognize my point about Uganda and Argentina. If Palestine was not the only option, which goes to show that this is a colonial project because they considered other states despite not having as strong of a religious claim.
Thank you for reminding me the third thing that you made originally. So there were other options. It wasn't just Uganda. It was Argentina, Bilobijan, Angola, and Madagascar. And this is what the world offered to the Jews, not what the Jews wanted. The Jews always wanted to go to Jerusalem. That's why we pray towards Jerusalem. When we get married,
let me finish. I'll answer that after.
When we smash the glass, in our weddings, right? I'm sure a lot of you have seen movies or have been to a Jewish wedding. It represents the destruction of Jerusalem and the promise that our kids will return back home and rebuild Jerusalem. Now, Uganda was proposed to the Jews by Herzl. He said, look, I know we're being killed right now in Europe, and we're about to be killed even more. If we don't get our land right now, at least we'll go to Uganda and then we'll go to Israel. And the Jews rejected that. This was imposed by other people, not by what we wanted.
So, but the British
Zion is in
people imposed the Balfour.
Jerusalem, which means to see peace. One day we will have peace in this land.
Means in the Canaanite language from, and then Shalim is the Canaanite god of dust, and that name has been around for centuries. 6,000 years.
It's also Hebrew Yehu, you will see, and Shalem, Salom being peace.
Actually, the Hebrew language, Ben Yehuda, the father of modern day Hebrew language, actually took many words from Arabic to revive that language because it has been dead for so many years.
We were still using Hebrew, it was not dead.
Existence.
There was continuous existence.
Yiddish.
We started Talmud. No, that's the spoken language. There was Ladino, there was Judeo-Arabic,
yes,
there were other Creoles spoken day to day.
No
but
Hebrew,
we learned the Torah, we learned Talmud.
Okay,
all of our
why did
texts
they
are in
have
Hebrew,
the JNF to beautify the landscape by planting non-indigenous trees all throughout Palestine?
So is beautifying not planting something non-indigenous?
No. I'm saying this is according to the JNF. They beautified the landscape. They took committees to go around the Arabic villages of the names and give them Hebrew equivalent names. The same way Benjamin Netanyahu changed his last name from Milikowski to Netanyahu.
Because last names are 200 years old.
Okay.
Last names are past 200 years. We did not have last names before. It was your name, son of your father, and of your tribe. And there are other Middle Eastern peoples who have a very similar culture to that. Last name are new inventions.
So why did they go from Milikowski to Netanyahu, and why did they change village names and give them Hebrew equivalent names with the modern Hebrew,
actually,
which is from Arabic to
we revived the name of Israel. Like, for example, Nablus, right? You know what Nablus comes from? It comes from Neapolis, which is Greek and Latin, which means new city. Right?
Okay.
But the Romans renamed our Shem, which was the indigenous name, to Neapolis. So when you have certain territories like Al-Quds going back to Jerusalem, which actually is called Jerusalem, or Safed going back to Tzfat, which is the original name, we're actually returning back to our language.
They actually had a committee, and
the language that your ancestors spoke. They spoke
hold on. They actually
not Arabic.
They spoke Aramaic as well.
Okay,
can I get to my point first? Why would they hire a committee to Judify the names of the town? If they had such a legitimate claim to it, and take the equivalent Arabic names and then give it. So you're saying that the Arabs
decolonized the name of the land.
Are you saying that the Arabs are colonizers
right now?
The Arabs
colonized the entire Middle East and North Africa.
So you're saying the
and
Palestinians...
you do not descend from the Arabs. You descend from the same family.
I would rather you not tell me. Okay, I would rather you not tell me where I come from.
Are you going to deny that?
No, I'm not going to. I just don't want to go into that. I'd rather focus right now. So we're talking about how they had specific committees to try to
decolonize the names.
Why? Okay, so you're saying that the Palestinians who had lived there, because you're denying the Nekba right now, because the Palestinians lived and called these their homes. Tentura was a home. Okay, awesome. I'm really glad that you're doing that. So Tentura and multiple other cities all throughout Palestine that the people resonated with when they were forcibly displaced, as you know, 750,000 of them. Why is it that they built cities on top of them and gave them Hebrew equivalent names to the Arab? I don't call that decolonization. That is textbook colonization and trying to legitimize whatever false claim comes from Theodore Herzl and the entire rest of his group. Okay. And I'd also like to look at one more thing. I have one more thing.
One at a time.
Yaffa,
Please remember
they marketed Yaffa as the land with no people for the people with no land. But this land was abundant with people, and Palestinians have consistently been present.
And
the Palestinian identity goes way back as well.
I believe you should have a right to live in this land. And if we look at what happened in 1948, there were Jewish villages and Palestinian villages that were destroyed. That is what happens during war. Now, all the Palestinian villages that were destroyed were Palestinian villages that sided with the other Arab armies from the surrounding nations around Israel that attacked Israel in 1948 to ethnically cleanse and destroy Israel, bringing all the Jews from the river and into the sea. There are many Jewish villages that were destroyed as well. Most of the village was civilians, were innocent. So many people were displaced that shouldn't have been displaced. Now we need to have a conversation of how to bring them back. But you're only talking about when Palestinians are suffering through war. I'm talking about when both are suffering through war. And when you take the names, Arabs are from Arabia, right? Jews are from Judea. It is very simple. Arabic language poured into that land. Arabic